Clean the spill first, then talk about becoming a doctor. The words landed sharp and clean, cutting through the low hum of grinders and quiet conversations like a blade made of silk. For a second, no one moved. The espresso machine hissed once, then fell silent, as if it, too, had heard the verdict. Ava Brooks stood behind the counter, her fingers still wrapped around a paper cup that had just tipped, a thin line of hot coffee sliding over the lid and onto her skin. She didn't pull away. Not immediately. The warmth spread across her knuckles, a slow sting, but her face didn't change. Across from her, Dr. Ethan Caldwell adjusted the cuff of his tailored shirt, the crisp white catching the morning light that filtered through the cafe windows. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. People like him never did. A couple seated near the window exchanged a glance. Someone near the pickup counter let out a soft, awkward chuckle, quickly swallowed. Ava reached for a cloth, steady, precise, and wiped the spill in one smooth motion, her movements practiced, almost invisible. On the surface, she was exactly what he saw, a barista in a worn apron, standing behind a counter, part of the background. But inside the front pocket of that apron, tucked between a pen and a folded receipt, was a stack of flashcards, their edges slightly curled, one corner stained with coffee. Latin terms. Arteries. Cranial nerves. Words she reviewed between orders, between breaths, between moments like this. Ethan watched her for a beat longer than necessary, his gaze clinical, detached, like he was evaluating a chart instead of a person. You're holding up the line, he added, not unkindly, but not kindly either, just efficient. Ava nodded once, as if acknowledging a fact, not a judgment. Sorry about that, she said, her voice calm, even, untouched by the tension hanging in the air. She set a fresh lid on the cup, slid it across the counter toward him, and met his eyes for the briefest second. Not defiant, not submissive, just steady. Something about that pause, less than a heartbeat, didn't fit the script he expected. But it passed. Moments like that always did. He took the cup without another word, turning slightly as his phone buzzed in his hand, already pulled back into a world where decisions were measured in operating rooms and outcomes. Behind him, the line began to move again, conversations picking up like nothing had happened, because for most people, nothing had. Ava exhaled slowly, almost silently, and reached for the next order ticket. Her hand brushed against the flashcards in her pocket, grounding her. On the far end of the counter, an elderly man struggled to steady his cup, his fingers trembling just enough to make the lid rattle softly. Ava noticed. She always noticed. She stepped over, adjusting the cup in his hands, angling it just right so it wouldn't slip. There you go, she said gently. The man looked at her, really looked this time, his eyes narrowing with quiet recognition. You study medicine, don't you? He asked, voice low, curious. Ava hesitated for half a second, then gave the smallest nod. Trying to, she replied. Behind her, the door chimed as Ethan stepped out into the morning, already forgetting the exchange, already moving on. Inside, Ava picked up the next cup, the rhythm returning, the world resetting. But something had shifted, subtle as a pulse beneath the surface, waiting. The bell above the cafe door chimed again, softer this time. As the morning rush thinned into a steady trickle, and Ava Brooks moved through the space with quiet precision, her hands remembering each motion before her mind had to catch up. Wipe, pour, slide, repeat. The rhythm of survival dressed up as routine, but her thoughts were elsewhere, circling the words that had been dropped in front of her like a verdict she never asked for. Dreams do not pay rent. She had heard versions of that sentence before, from teachers who lowered their expectations when they saw her address, from advisors who suggested something more practical, from strangers who never meant harm but never offered belief either. And still, she had kept going, not loudly, not visibly, but steadily, like water carving stone over time. Behind the counter the scent of roasted beans lingered thick in the air, mixing with the faint citrus of cleaning spray and the quiet hum of refrigeration units, grounding her in the present even as her mind drifted forward. Always forward. The elderly man she had helped earlier sat near the corner now, his cup steady between both hands, watching the room with a kind of patient awareness that felt different from the rest, as if he saw not just what was happening but what could be. Ava finished a latte, placing it carefully on the pickup counter, her fingers brushing once more against the flashcards in her pocket, the edges worn from repetition. Brachial plexus, median nerve, radial artery. Words she whispered to herself in the quiet hours after her second job ended, when the city dimmed and the world finally gave her space to think. A young woman stepped up to the register, phone in hand, barely looking up as she ordered, and Ava nodded, inputting the order with practiced ease. But her attention flickered again when the elderly man stood, slower this time, his movements deliberate, controlled, as he approached the counter, not as a customer now, but as someone with intention. "That was not luck," he said, his voice calm, measured, and Ava looked up, meeting his gaze, unsure for a moment what he meant. "The way you adjusted my grip," he continued, lifting his hand slightly, the faint tremor still there, but less pronounced. "You did not guess that." Ava hesitated, her instinct always to downplay, to deflect, to remain small enough to pass unnoticed, but something in his tone made that difficult. "I have seen it before," she said quietly, choosing her words with care. "My uncle had similar symptoms." It was not the full truth, but it was close enough to stand on. The man studied her for a moment longer, then gave a slow nod, as if confirming something to himself rather than to her. "Observation is the first skill they teach," he said, almost to himself. "Most people never really learn it." Ava felt the words settle somewhere deeper than she expected, not heavy, but anchoring. Before she could respond, another order came through, the printer clicking sharply, pulling her back into motion. She turned, preparing the next drink, but the man's voice followed gently. "Do not let someone else define the limits of what you see." Ava paused, just for a fraction of a second, her hand hovering over the espresso handle. The metal cooled beneath her fingers. Then she continued, locking it into place, the machine roaring back to life, masking everything else. Outside, the late morning sun climbed higher, casting longer reflections across the glass, and somewhere across the city, Dr. Ethan Caldwell stepped into a different room, one filled with polished floors and quiet authority, already moving toward his next lecture, his next case, his next decision, unaware that a moment he had dismissed so easily was still unfolding, still taking shape, not in confrontation, not in defiance, but in something quieter, something harder to ignore. Ava placed the finished drink on the counter, calling out the name with steady clarity, her voice blending into the rhythm of the café. But beneath it, something had shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but enough to matter, enough to carry forward. That night, the café lights dimmed one by one, each click of a switch softening the room until only the faint glow from the street outside filtered through the glass, stretching long reflections across the polished floor, and Ava Brooks stood alone behind the counter, wiping down the last surface with slow, deliberate movements, the scent of bleach mixing with the lingering warmth of roasted beans, a smell that clung to her clothes no matter how many times she washed them. Her hands moved automatically now, muscle memory guiding each pass of the cloth, but her mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying the morning in fragments, not the words themselves, but the way the room had gone still, the way people had watched without saying anything, the way she had felt the heat on her skin and chosen not to react, not because it did not matter, but because reacting would have changed nothing. She set the cloth aside and reached into her apron, pulling out the stack of flashcards, the edges soft from use, the ink slightly smudged on a few where moisture had found its way in. She flipped to one at random, optic nerve, function, visual processing, and read it silently, her lips barely moving, the quiet of the empty cafe wrapping around her like a second skin. Outside, a car passed slowly, headlights gliding across the window before disappearing into the night. Ava leaned back against the counter for a moment, closing her eyes, not in exhaustion, but in focus, picturing diagrams she had memorized, pathways she could trace in her mind without looking, connections that made sense in a way the rest of her life sometimes did not. A soft sound behind her broke the silence, the door opening just enough to let in a draft of cool air. She turned, expecting a late customer, but it was the elderly man from earlier, his figure framed in the doorway, coat pulled tight around his shoulders. "I thought you were closed," he said, his voice carrying easily in the quiet space. Ava straightened, instinctively moving back into position. "We are," she replied, her tone polite, but not dismissive. The man stepped inside anyway, closing the door gently behind him, as if careful not to disturb something fragile. I will not take long, he added, walking toward the counter with measured steps. Ava watched him, unsure of what he wanted now, but she did not interrupt. She had learned that sometimes people needed a moment to say what they came to say. He reached the counter and rested his hand lightly against the edge, steady this time, no visible tremor. I used to teach, he said simply, and Ava felt something shift, not in the room, but in the weight of the conversation. Internal medicine, 30 years, he continued, his eyes meeting hers with quiet clarity. I have seen thousands of students walk into a classroom thinking they know what matters. He paused, just long enough for the words to settle. Very few actually do. Ava held his gaze, her fingers tightening slightly around the flashcard still in her hand. You saw something today that others did not, he said, nodding toward her pocket. And you did not hesitate to act on it. Ava exhaled slowly, the memory of the moment returning, not as a highlight, but as something natural, almost instinctive. It was nothing, she said, the words automatic, familiar. The same ones she had used for years to keep expectations low, to keep attention away. The man shook his head once, not sharply, but with certainty. That is what people say when they do not understand the value of what they have. He replied, his voice firm but not unkind. Ava looked down briefly, then back up, unsure how to respond to that. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small card, placing it gently on the counter between them. There is a lecture tomorrow morning, he said. Teaching hospital, downtown, 8 o'clock. Ava glanced at the card. The name printed clearly, the hospital she had passed countless times but never entered. Guest lecture on diagnostic reasoning, he added. You should be there. Ava hesitated, her mind immediately listing reasons why she could not. Her shift, her second job, the cost of missing hours she needed, the risk of stepping into a place that was not meant for her. I am not enrolled, she said quietly, the truth simple and heavy. The man gave a small, knowing smile. Observation is not limited to enrollment, he replied. Sometimes the door is not locked, people just assume it is. Ava felt the words settle deep, heavier than before, not as pressure, but as possibility. Outside, the streetlight flickered once, casting a brief shadow across the counter. She looked at the card. Again, her reflection faintly visible in its glossy surface. Then back at the man. Why are you telling me this? She asked, her voice steady but searching. He considered the question for a moment, then answered plainly. Because someone once told me the same thing, he said, and I almost did not listen. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, charged with something unspoken. The kind of moment that does not announce itself, but changes everything quietly. Ava closed her fingers around the card, the edges pressing lightly into her palm, grounding her. And for the first time that day, the words from the morning did not echo as loudly, replaced instead by something softer, but stronger, something that did not argue, did not defend, just waited to be proven true. The city was still half asleep when Ava Brooks stepped off the bus, the early morning air cool against her skin, carrying the faint scent of rain from the night before. And for a moment she stood there, just outside the tall glass entrance of the teaching hospital, looking up at the building as it caught the first light of sunrise, the windows reflecting a pale gold that made everything feel distant, almost unreachable. In her hand the small card felt heavier than it should, its edges worn, slightly from how tightly she had held it all night. She had not slept much, turning over every reason she should not be here, every practical thought that told her to go back, to stay within the lines she had always been given. And yet she had still come. Her shoes echoed softly against the polished floor as she stepped inside, the sound sharper than expected in the quiet lobby. People moved with purpose around her, doctors in white coats, students with neatly pressed scrubs, conversations low and focused, a different kind of rhythm than the café, faster, more precise, less forgiving. Ava adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, suddenly aware of every detail that set her apart. The simplicity of her clothes, the absence of a badge, the way she hesitated for half a second longer than everyone else before choosing a direction. She followed the signs toward the lecture hall, her steps steady but measured. each one a quiet decision to keep going. Inside the room, rows of seats curved downward toward a central podium, screens glowing softly with slides already prepared. Students filled the seats in clusters, their voices blending into a low hum of anticipation. Ava paused at the entrance, scanning the room, calculating where she could sit without being noticed, without drawing attention to the fact that she did not officially belong. She moved toward the back, choosing a seat near the aisle, close enough to hear but far enough to remain invisible. She placed her bag on her lap, fingers brushing once more against the flashcards inside, grounding herself, reminding herself why she was here. The room slowly settled, conversations fading as the door near the front opened, and a figure stepped in with quiet authority. Dr. Ethan Caldwell moved to the podium with the same controlled confidence he carried everywhere, his presence shifting the atmosphere almost instantly, as if the room itself adjusted to him. Ava felt it before she fully registered who he was, a subtle tightening in her chest. A recognition that came not from his face at first, but from the tone, the posture, the way silence followed him. Then she saw him clearly, the same man from the café, the same measured expression, the same certainty in his movements. For a brief second, something flickered across her face, not fear, not hesitation, but awareness, the kind that sharpens rather than shrinks. Ethan glanced out over the room, his gaze sweeping across rows of students, not searching, just assessing, cataloging, and then it moved on, passing over Ava without pause, without recognition, because why would it not? She was just another face, another presence in a room full of them. He began speaking, his voice calm, precise, filling the space with practiced ease. Diagnostic reasoning is not about what is obvious, he said, the words carrying clearly to the back of the room. It is about what others overlook. Ava listened, her focus narrowing, every distraction fading into the background, the irony of the moment settling quietly beneath the surface, not loud, not dramatic, just present. He continued, outlining a case study, describing symptoms, patterns, possibilities, the kind of scenario designed to test not memory, but perception. Students leaned forward, some taking notes, others watching intently. Ava remained still, her mind already moving ahead, connecting details, filtering noise, the same way she had done countless times before. Only now the stakes felt different, not because the room demanded it, but because she did. Ethan paused mid-explanation, scanning the room again. So, he said, folding his hands lightly. What are we missing? The question hung in the air, inviting answers, expecting them. A few hands lifted hesitantly, voices offering possibilities, each one logical, each one incomplete. Ava felt the answer forming before she fully realized it. Clear, simple, grounded. In the same instinct that had guided her the day before, she hesitated for a fraction of a second, the weight of the room pressing in, the memory of words meant to limit echoing faintly. Then she lifted her hand, just slightly, not high, not demanding attention, just enough to be seen. And for the first time since he entered the room, Ethan Caldwell's gaze stopped, not because he recognized her, but because something in that small, steady motion did not fit the pattern he expected, and for a moment, the room held its breath. The silence stretched just a fraction longer than it should have, thin and fragile, like glass under pressure, as Dr. Ethan Caldwell's eyes settled on the raised hand near the back of the room. Not high, not insistent, just present, steady, and for a brief moment, something in his expression shifted, not recognition, not yet, but curiosity sharpened by habit. He gestured lightly with one hand, granting permission without breaking the rhythm of the room. Yes, he said, his voice even, controlled, and every head within a few seats of Ava turned slightly, drawn by the quiet confidence it took to speak from the margins. Ava lowered her hand slowly, her posture unchanged, her voice calm when it came. The tremor is not the primary issue, she said, not rushing, not hesitating, each word placed carefully. It is compensatory. A few students frowned, glancing at one another, trying to follow. Ethan's gaze narrowed slightly, not in dismissal, but in focus. Go on, he said, folding his arms loosely. Ava inhaled once, steadying the thread of thought she had already completed in her mind. The loss of fine motor control suggests early neurological involvement, but the patient's grip adaptation indicates awareness and adjustment. She continued, her tone measured. If it were purely degenerative, the response would be inconsistent. But here it is patterned. A quiet ripple moved through the room, the kind that does not come from noise but from recognition. Ethan did not interrupt, his attention now fully anchored. You are suggesting, he said slowly, that the symptom is not the origin. Ava met his gaze without tension. Yes, she replied simply. It points to something underlying, something earlier, something missed. The word lingered, not accusatory, just factual. Ethan turned slightly, glancing at the slide behind him, then back to her, recalibrating. And your conclusion? He prompted, the room leaning. And without realizing it, Ava paused for a fraction of a second, not searching, but choosing clarity over speed. Early-stage neurological disorder with adaptive behavior masking progression, she said, her voice quiet but unmistakably certain. The tremor is not the problem, it is the signal. The silence that followed was different from before, no longer fragile, but full, dense with the weight of what had just been placed into it. Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer, something unreadable, moving beneath the surface. Then he nodded once, small, precise, correct, he said, the word landing cleanly, cutting through the room sharper than anything that had come before. A few students shifted in their seats. Others looked back at Ava again, this time not with curiosity, but with recalculation. Ethan turned back to the class, continuing the lecture, expanding on the diagnosis, but his tone had changed, subtly. The cadence adjusted, as if the center of gravity in the room had shifted. By a degree no one could measure, but everyone could feel. Ava lowered her eyes briefly, not out of modesty, but to release the moment before it became something else, her fingers brushing against the edge of her bag, grounding herself again. She had not spoken to prove anything, not to him, not to them, just because the answer had been there, clear and waiting. The lecture moved forward, cases layered on top of cases. But something lingered, a quiet thread connecting the back row to the front. Ethan asked another question later, more complex, more nuanced, and before he finished, his gaze flicked once, almost unconsciously, toward where Ava sat, as if checking for something he had not expected to find. And in that small, nearly invisible gesture, the first fracture appeared, not in his authority, but in his certainty, because for the first time, the pattern he relied on had been interrupted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to make him look twice. And in a room built on observation, that was where everything began to change. The silence stretched just a fraction longer than it should have, thin and fragile, like glass under pressure, as Dr. Ethan Caldwell's eyes settled on the raised hand near the back of the room. Not high, not insistent, just present, steady. And for a brief moment, something in his expression shifted, not recognition, not yet, but curiosity sharpened by habit. He gestured lightly with one hand, granting permission without breaking the rhythm of the room. Yes, he said, his voice even, controlled, and every head within a few seats of Ava turned slightly, drawn by the quiet confidence it took to speak from the margins. Ava lowered her hand slowly, her posture unchanged, her voice calm when it came. The tremor is not the primary issue, she said, not rushing, not hesitating, each word placed carefully. It is compensatory. A few students frowned, glancing at one another, trying to follow. Ethan's gaze narrowed slightly, not in dismissal, but in focus. Go on, he said, folding his arms loosely. Ava inhaled once, steadying the thread of thought she had already completed in her mind. The loss of fine motor control suggests early neurological involvement, but the patient's grip adaptation indicates awareness and adjustment. She continued, her tone measured. If it were purely degenerative, the response would be inconsistent, but here it is patterned. A quiet ripple moved through the room, the kind that does not come from noise, but from recognition. Ethan did not interrupt, his attention now fully anchored. You are suggesting, he said slowly, that the symptom is not the origin. Ava met his gaze without tension. Yes, she replied simply. It points to something underlying, something earlier, something missed. The word lingered, not accusatory, just factual. Ethan turned slightly, glancing at the slide behind him, then back to her, recalibrating. And your conclusion, he prompted, the room leaning in without realizing it. Ava paused for a fraction of a second, not searching, but choosing clarity over speed. Early-stage neurological disorder with adaptive behavior masking progression, she said, her voice quiet but unmistakably certain. The tremor is not the problem, it is the signal. The silence that followed was different from before, no longer fragile, but full, dense with the weight of what had just been placed into it. Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer, something unreadable moving beneath the surface. Then he nodded once, small, precise, correct, he said, the word landing cleanly, cutting through the room sharper than anything that had come before. A few students shifted in their seats. Others looked back at Ava again, this time not with curiosity, but with recalculation. Ethan turned back to the class, continuing the lecture, expanding on the diagnosis, but his tone had changed, subtly, the cadence adjusted, as if the center of gravity in the room had shifted by a degree no one could measure but everyone could feel. Ava lowered her eyes briefly, not out of modesty, but to release the moment before it became something else, her fingers brushing against the edge of her bag, grounding herself again. She had not spoken to prove anything, not to him, not to them, just because the answer had been there, clear and waiting. The lecture moved forward, cases layered on top of cases, but something lingered, a quiet thread connecting the back row to the front. Ethan asked another question later, more complex, more nuanced, and before he finished, his gaze flicked once, almost unconsciously, toward where Ava sat, as if checking for something he had not expected to find. And in that small, nearly invisible gesture, the first fracture appeared, not in his authority, but in his certainty, because for the first time, the pattern he relied on had been interrupted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to make him look twice. And in a room built on observation, that was where everything began to change. The room did not return to normal after that answer. Not completely. Something subtle had shifted beneath the surface, like a current changing direction where no one could see it, and Ava Brooks felt it not in the way people looked at her, but in the way they did not look away as quickly anymore. The lecture continued, cases unfolding one after another. But now there was a quiet pattern forming. Each time Dr. Ethan Caldwell posed a question, there was a pause, not the usual hesitation of uncertainty, but something more deliberate, as if the room itself had learned to wait, to see if that same steady voice from the back would rise again. Ava did not rush to speak. She never did. Her hands rested lightly on her bag, fingers brushing the worn fabric, grounding herself in something familiar while her mind moved through each scenario with quiet precision. She did not need to prove anything, not to them, not to him. She only followed what she saw, what made sense, what aligned beneath the noise. Ethan moved through the material with the same control as before, but something in his cadence had changed, a fraction slower, a fraction more attentive, as if he were listening not just to the answers given, but to the spaces between them. At one point, he described a more complex case, layered symptoms, conflicting indicators, the kind designed to mislead even strong students. Assume the obvious diagnosis is wrong, he said, his voice steady. What remains? A few hands rose. Responses came, structured, textbook, safe. Ethan nodded, acknowledging them, but not fully satisfied. His gaze shifted again, almost unconsciously, toward the back row, toward Ava, and this time, it lingered a second longer. She felt it, not as pressure, but as recognition forming, incomplete, unfinished. She lifted her hand again, not higher than before, not with urgency, just enough. Ethan inclined his head slightly, granting the space. The contradiction is the clue, Ava said, her voice calm, threading through the quiet room. If the symptoms do not align, it is not because the case is unclear, it is because we are combining two different processes. A murmur moved through the seats, softer this time, more focused. Ethan's expression remained composed, but his eyes sharpened. Explain, he said, and Ava did, not in long explanations, but in clear, precise steps, separating variables, isolating signals, the way someone does when they have practiced not just memorizing, but seeing, truly seeing. And as she spoke, something else became clear, not just to the room, But to Ethan, this was not guesswork, not instinct alone. This was trained thinking, disciplined, structured, earned. When she finished, the silence that followed was not uncertainty. It was acknowledgement. Ethan turned slightly, looking at the screen, then back at her, and for a moment, the distance between podium and back row felt smaller than it should. That is one way to approach it, he said, but his tone carried something new, not dismissal, not even neutrality, something closer to respect, though he did not name it. The lecture moved on, but the energy had changed. Students who had spoken confidently before now listened differently, recalibrating, adjusting their sense of where authority came from. Ava lowered her gaze again, not retreating, but returning to herself, the moment passing through her rather than staying, because she had learned that holding onto it too tightly could change it into something else, something heavier, something she did not need. The clock on the wall ticked forward, each second marking the slow shift of something deeper than a single lecture. And as the session neared its end, Ethan closed his notes, pausing for a brief moment, his eyes scanning the room one last time. But this time, when they reached the back, they did not pass over her. They stopped, not fully understanding yet, but no longer overlooking, and in that quiet, almost invisible pause, the first real question formed in his mind, not about the case, not about the lecture, but about her, and why someone like her was sitting there, unseen until now. The lecture ended without applause, just the soft shuffle of chairs and the low murmur of conversations returning as students gathered their notes. But the air did not fully release what had built inside it. Something remained, quiet and unresolved, like a question left hanging between breaths. Ava Brooks stayed seated for a moment longer than most, her hands resting lightly on her back, feeling the texture beneath her fingers as if anchoring herself before stepping back into a world that did not usually make space for moments like this. Around her, voices overlapped, some analytical, some impressed, some uncertain. "Did you hear that answer?" Someone whispered a few seats down. "She was not even on the roster." Another replied, the words not meant to carry, but they did, drifting just enough to reach her without weight, without malice, just observation. Ava stood slowly, adjusting the strap on her shoulder. Her movements calm, unhurried, as if nothing unusual had happened, because, for her, it had not been unusual. It had been familiar. The act of seeing clearly when others hesitated, the act of speaking only when necessary. She moved toward the aisle, blending into the flow of students exiting the room, the polished floor reflecting soft light from above, each step measured, quiet. As she approached the door, a voice cut gently through the movement, not loud, but precise enough to stop her without force. "You," it said, and for a fraction of a second, the world narrowed. Again, Ava turned, her expression steady, and there he was, Dr. Ethan Caldwell, standing just off the podium, no longer elevated, no longer framed by authority, but still carrying it in the way he held himself. His eyes fixed on her now, not scanning, not passing over, but focused, intentional. The space between them felt different from before, less distant, more defined. "Stay for a moment," he added, his tone neutral, but edged with something sharper, curiosity, perhaps, or something he had not yet named. The room continued to empty around them, footsteps fading, voices dissolving into the hallway until the lecture hall was left in a quieter state, the kind that makes every sound more noticeable, the hum of the overhead lights, the faint echo of a door closing somewhere far down the corridor. Ava stepped back from the aisle, not hesitant, not eager, just present, waiting. Ethan walked a few steps closer, stopping at a distance that was neither confrontational nor casual, just enough to hold a conversation without raising his voice. He studied her for a moment, not rudely, but thoroughly, as if trying to place a detail that did not fit where it should. "You are not enrolled in this program," he said finally, not as a question, but as a statement. Ava did not look away. "No," she replied simply, the word clear, unembellished. Ethan's gaze shifted briefly to her bag, then back to her face, taking in the details he had missed before, the absence of an identification badge, the subtle wear on her sleeves, the quiet composure that did not align with someone out of place. "Then how?" he began, then stopped himself, adjusting the question mid-thought. How do you know this material? Ava considered the question for a moment, not because she did not have an answer, but because she understood what was really being asked beneath it. I study, she said, her voice even, whenever I can. The simplicity of it hung in the air, almost too plain for the complexity it carried. Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly, not in doubt, but in recalibration. That is not enough to explain what I heard today, he said, and there was no accusation in it. Only fact. Ava's fingers tightened slightly around the strap of her bag, grounding herself again. It explains enough, she replied, not defensive, not dismissive, just steady. Ethan exhaled quietly, a subtle shift in his posture, as if something within his framework had just been challenged, not broken, but bent. What is your name? He asked, the question direct, necessary. Ava met his gaze without hesitation. Ava Brooks, she said, and for the first time since that morning in the café, her name existed in his awareness, not as a passing detail, but as something that required attention, something that could no longer be dismissed. Ethan nodded once, as if marking it, committing it to memory. Ava Brooks, he repeated, quieter now, not for emphasis, but for confirmation. The silence that followed was not empty. It was shifting, something recalibrating beneath the surface, and in that moment, the distance between who she was in his world yesterday and who she was now began to close, not completely, not yet, but enough to change the direction of everything that would come next. The hallway outside the lecture hall carried a different kind of noise, softer but more layered, footsteps blending with distant conversations and the faint echo of rolling carts somewhere deeper in the building. But for Ava Brooks, everything felt slightly muted, as if her focus had narrowed to a single thread she was still holding, the sound of her own name spoken in a voice that had dismissed her just a day before. She walked beside Dr. Ethan Caldwell now, not close enough to suggest familiarity, not far enough to suggest distance, just within the space of a conversation that neither of them had fully defined yet. The polished floor reflected their movement in broken fragments beneath them, white light stretching across the surface, steady and cold. Ethan spoke first, not looking at her immediately, his gaze forward, as if organizing his thoughts before letting them take form. You said you study whenever you can, he began, his tone measured, not probing, but precise. Where? Ava adjusted the strap of her bag slightly, the motion small, grounding. At home, she said, at night, mostly. Ethan nodded once, absorbing the answer, but not satisfied by its simplicity. What materials? He asked, and this time there was a subtle shift, not in authority, but in curiosity that had moved beyond surface level. Ava glanced ahead, then back toward him briefly. Textbooks, online lectures, anything I can access, she replied, her voice steady. Second-hand books when I can afford them. The words were factual, not framed for sympathy, just stated as they were. Ethan slowed his pace slightly, as if the conversation required more space than the hallway allowed. And you understand all of it, he said, not as disbelief, but as an equation that did not balance easily. Ava did not answer immediately, not because she doubted herself, but because she understood the weight behind the question. I understand what I take the time to learn, she said finally. And there was something in the way she said it that carried more than the words themselves, something earned, something built quietly over time. They reached a wider section of the corridor where the light shifted, softer now through a row of tall windows, casting long shadows that moved slightly with each passing figure. Ethan stopped, turning toward her fully for the first time since they left the lecture hall, his expression unreadable at first glance, but not closed. Why are you not enrolled? He asked, the question direct, unavoidable. Ava met his gaze without hesitation, the answer already formed long before he asked it. Because I could not afford to continue, she said, her tone even, without apology, without explanation beyond what was necessary. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but it carried weight, the kind that settles between two people when something real has been placed in the space between them. Ethan exhaled slowly, a subtle shift in his posture, as if recalibrating something internal. You were enrolled before, he said, connecting the pieces. Ava nodded once. Pre-medical track, she confirmed. I left after my second year. Ethan's eyes flickered briefly. processing, aligning what he had seen in the lecture with what he was hearing now. And you continued on your own, he said, not as a question, but as recognition. Ava's grip on her bag tightened slightly, not from tension, but from memory, long nights, quiet rooms, the weight of responsibility that did not pause for ambition. I did not want to forget, she said, and the simplicity of it carried something deeper, something that did not need elaboration. Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer, and in that moment, the distance between assumption and understanding narrowed further, not completely, but enough to shift his perspective in a way that could not be undone easily. There is an advanced session this afternoon, he said after a pause, his tone returning to something more structured, but not unchanged. Smaller group, more intensive. He glanced at her briefly, then back down the hallway, as if weighing the decision even as he spoke it. You can attend. The words were simple, but they did not carry the same casual dismissal as before. They carried intention. Ava did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but because she understood the significance of what was being offered, not as permission, but as acknowledgement. She nodded once, a small, controlled motion. Thank you, she said, her voice steady, not overly grateful, not distant, just real. Ethan inclined his head slightly in return, a gesture that mirrored her restraint, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the hallway continuing around them, people passing, conversations rising and falling, but within that small space, something had shifted again, quieter than before, but stronger, not built on words alone, but on what had been seen, recognized, and no longer ignored. The advanced session room was smaller, quieter, the kind of space where every sound carried just a little further and every mistake felt just a little heavier. The chairs arranged in a tight semicircle around a central table instead of rows, forcing proximity, forcing presence. And when Ava Brooks stepped inside that afternoon, the shift was immediate. A few heads turned, not all, but enough. Enough to register that she did not belong to the expected pattern. No badge, no familiar face, no easy label. She chose a seat near the edge, not hiding, but not claiming the center either, her bag resting against her knee, fingers lightly touching the worn fabric as if it held more than just books. The room filled slowly. A handful of students, fewer than before, their conversations lower, more focused, the tone different from the morning lecture. This was not performance. This was precision. The door closed with a soft click, and a moment later, Dr. Ethan Caldwell entered, his presence less formal now, no podium to separate him from the group, just the table, the shared space. He glanced around once, taking in the room, and when his eyes reached Ava, they did not pass over her this time. They paused, brief but deliberate, acknowledgement without announcement. Then he began. No introduction, no framing, just a case placed directly into the center. 47-year-old patient, he said, his voice steady, controlled. Chronic fatigue, intermittent dizziness, inconsistent lab results. He looked around the room. You do not have the full chart. You do not get it. You work with what you see. The challenge was clear, stripped down, no safety net. Students leaned forward, some already reaching for notes, others thinking aloud, hypotheses forming quickly, sometimes too quickly. Ava listened, her attention narrowing, filtering through the noise, separating what was said from what mattered. Ethan moved through the group, not directing, but observing, letting them reveal how they thought, how they approached uncertainty. A student near the center offered a confident diagnosis, structured, textbook, clean. Ethan nodded slightly, but did not confirm. Another suggested a variation, adding complexity, still incomplete. The room shifted, tension building quietly as answers layered without resolution. Ava remained still, not because she had nothing to say, but because she was waiting, not for the right moment, but for clarity, the pattern beneath the pattern. Ethan stopped near the table, his fingers resting lightly against the surface. You are all circling the symptoms, he said, his tone calm, but edged with something firmer, not the cause. The words settled into the room, redirecting focus. Ava's mind moved again, faster now, aligning fragments, discarding distractions, seeing the gaps. She lifted her gaze slightly, not raising her hand this time, but meeting the space where the answer existed. and Ethan noticed, not the movement, but the stillness, the kind that signals certainty rather than hesitation. "Ava," he said, her name now part of the room, part of the structure, and the shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable. She straightened slightly, not out of formality, but readiness. "What do you see?" he asked, not testing, not challenging, but asking, directly. Ava spoke without rush, her voice steady, grounded. "The inconsistency is not random," she said. "It aligns with external variables, not internal failure." A few students glanced at her, recalculating. Ethan's gaze sharpened. "Explain," he said, and she did, tracing the pattern, isolating the influence, pointing to something overlooked not because it was hidden, but because it was dismissed as irrelevant. When she finished, the room fell quiet again, not out of confusion, but recognition. Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer than before, something deeper shifting beneath his composure. Not just acknowledgement now, but reassessment, not of the case, but of her, and perhaps, quietly, of himself. He nodded once, slow, deliberate. "Good," he said, the word simple, but carrying weight it had not held earlier, and in that moment, the space between them changed again, not defined by hierarchy, not by assumption, but by something far more difficult to ignore, the truth of what was being seen, and the quiet realization that it had been there all along. The session did not end with noise. It ended with a kind of quiet that lingered, heavier than before, as if the room itself needed a moment to adjust to what had just unfolded. Chairs shifted softly, notebooks closed, but no one rushed to leave, not immediately, because something had changed in a way that did not invite quick movement. Ava Brooks remained seated for a brief second longer, her hands resting lightly on her bag, her breathing steady, controlled, as if releasing the tension in small, measured increments. Around her, a few students glanced in her direction again, not with curiosity now, but with something closer to respect, though none of them said it out loud. They did not need to. It was in the way they recalibrated their silence, the way they chose not to interrupt the space she occupied. Dr. Ethan Caldwell stood at the center table, gathering his notes with the same precision he applied to everything else, but his movements were slower now, not delayed, just deliberate, as if each action carried more weight than it had earlier. He did not look at Ava right away, not because he had not noticed her, but because he was thinking, processing, aligning what he had seen with what he believed to be true. And for someone like him, that alignment did not come easily. When the pattern broke, the last student stepped out, the door closing softly behind them, leaving the room. Quieter, more contained, the hum of the overhead lights filling the space between them. Ava stood, adjusting the strap of her bag, preparing to leave without drawing attention, the way she always had, the way she had learned to move through spaces that were not built with her in mind. But before she reached the door, his voice came again, not sharp, not commanding, just present. "Ava," he said, and this time there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty. She stopped, turning back toward him, her posture steady, her expression calm. He took a few steps closer, closing the distance not as authority, but as intention. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence not empty, but full, carrying everything that had shifted between yesterday and now. "I was wrong," he said finally, the words simple, unguarded, and they did not come easily, not from him, not from someone who had built his life on being certain. Ava did not react immediately, not because she did not hear him, but because she understood the weight behind those words. He continued, quieter now. "Yesterday at the café," he added, not needing to repeat the details, the memory clear enough on its own. "I made an assumption." The admission settled into the room, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. Ava held his gaze, her hands still, her breathing even. She could have answered in many ways, could have pointed out the obvious, could have matched his words with something sharper, something justified, but she did not. Instead, she chose something else, something quieter, something that required more control than reaction. "Most people do," she said, her voice calm, not dismissive, not forgiving, just true. Ethan absorbed that, the simplicity of it, the absence of accusation, and for a moment, something shifted again inside him, not just recognition, but understanding. The kind that does not come from being told, but from seeing. He nodded once, slower this time, as if accepting. More than just the moment. It does not make it right, he said, not to defend himself, but to acknowledge the gap between knowing and doing. Ava's expression did not change, but there was a subtle softening, not in acceptance, but in clarity. No, she replied, just as simply. The words steady, grounded. The silence that followed was different now, not tense, not uncertain, but balanced, two people standing in it without needing to fill it. Ethan glanced briefly at the table, then back at her, as if considering something further, something beyond apology. You should not be studying alone, he said, the statement direct, not framed as an offer yet, but as recognition of something that should not continue as it was. Ava's fingers tightened slightly around her bag, the weight of those words landing deeper than the ones before, not because they were louder, but because they pointed towards something she had not allowed herself to consider fully. Not yet. She did not answer immediately, not out of doubt, but because she understood that what came next would not be small. And in that pause, in that quiet space between what was said and what would be decided, everything stood still for just a moment longer, waiting. The silence stretched just a moment longer, not uncomfortable, but deliberate, as if the room itself understood that whatever came next would carry more weight than anything said before. Ava Brooks stood still, her fingers resting lightly against the strap of her bag, feeling the familiar texture beneath her touch, grounding herself in something real while the words lingered in the air between them. You should not be studying alone. It was not an offer yet, not fully, but it was no longer just an observation either. It was a shift, a door that had not existed for her before now standing slightly open, and she could feel the difference, not as pressure, but as possibility. She looked at Dr. Ethan Caldwell, really looked this time, not at the title, not at the authority, but at the person standing in front of her, someone who had spoken too quickly the day before, someone who was now choosing his words more carefully, and that mattered, not because it erased anything, but because it showed change, and change, she had learned, was not something to dismiss lightly. I manage, she said finally, her voice calm, not defensive, just honest, because she always had, long nights, early mornings, pages read under dim light, knowledge built piece by piece without guidance, without structure, without anyone telling her she was on the right path. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging that truth without challenging it. That is clear, he said, his tone steady, but there was something else beneath it now. Something quieter, more deliberate. But managing is not the same as being supported. The words settled differently, not as correction, but as expansion. Ava held his gaze, considering, not rejecting, not accepting, just weighing, because she understood what support meant, and she also understood the cost of relying on something that could be taken away. Support usually comes with conditions, she replied, her voice even, and there was no bitterness in it, just experience. Ethan did not look away. He did not deny it either. Sometimes, he said, and the honesty in that single word carried more weight than a longer explanation would have. He took a small breath, as if choosing the next step carefully. This does not, he added, not quickly, not as persuasion, but as a statement he intended to stand by. Ava's grip on her bag tightened slightly, not from fear, but from the shift happening beneath the surface. She was not being offered charity, not being positioned as someone to be fixed. She was being recognized, and that was different, fundamentally different. What are you offering? She asked, not because she did not understand, but because she needed to hear it clearly, defined. Without assumption, Ethan inclined his head slightly, as if he had been waiting for that question. Access, he said, simple, precise, to lectures, to materials, to guidance. He paused briefly, letting the words settle. To the structure you have been building on your own. Ava's eyes did not leave his, her expression steady, but something beneath it shifted, something quieter, something that had been held tightly for a long time beginning to loosen, not completely, but enough to let possibility through. Why? She asked, the question soft, but direct, because she needed to understand not just what was being offered, but why it existed now. Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he did not have an answer, but because he understood that the wrong one would matter. He looked at her, Not past her, not through her, but at her. And when he spoke, his voice carried none of the distance it had before. Because talent should not depend on where someone stands when you first see them, he said. The words quiet, but grounded, not rehearsed, not polished, just real. Ava let that sit. The simplicity of it, the truth of it, the way it aligned with something she had always believed but rarely heard spoken out loud. She nodded once, small, controlled, not agreement yet, but acknowledgement. I still have responsibilities, she said, her voice steady. I work. Ethan nodded again, already understanding the weight behind that. Then we work around them. He replied, not dismissing, not minimizing, but adapting. And that, more than anything else, shifted the moment. Because it was not about asking her to fit into a system, it was about adjusting the system to meet her where she was. Ava exhaled slowly, the breath quiet, almost unnoticeable, but it carried something with it. A release, a shift, a step forward that had taken longer than this moment to reach. She looked at him once more, measuring, confirming, then gave a small nod. Okay, she said. The word simple, but it changed everything. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. Enough to move the story forward into something neither of them had planned, but both of them now understood mattered. The hospital corridor felt different in the days that followed, not because the building had changed, but because Ava Brooks moved through it with a quiet certainty that had not been there before, her steps still measured, still deliberate, but no longer hesitant at the thresholds. The early mornings remained the same. The long hours balancing work and study did not disappear, but something within those hours shifted. They were no longer built in isolation, no longer held together by sheer persistence alone. In a small office tucked between lecture rooms, notes began to take a different shape, guided, refined, challenged in ways she had not experienced before. And across from her, Dr. Ethan Caldwell adjusted not just his expectations, but his attention, the way he listened, the way he paused before responding, the way he allowed space for her reasoning to unfold fully before stepping in. It was not immediate, not effortless, but it was real. One afternoon, as light filtered softly through the blinds, casting narrow lines across the desk, Ava worked through a case file, her voice low but steady as she explained her approach. Ethan listened, not interrupting, not correcting, just observing. And when she finished, there was a moment of silence, not filled with critique, but with recognition. You are not following patterns, he said finally, his tone quieter than it had been weeks ago. You are building them. Ava did not look up immediately, her eyes still on the page, absorbing the words without reacting to them, because she understood something now that she had not needed to say before. Validation did not change the work, it only confirmed it. Outside, the city moved as it always did, people rushing past, lives intersecting without pause. But inside that room, something steady had formed, not loud, not dramatic, just consistent. A rhythm built on mutual respect rather than assumption. Weeks passed, then months, and the distance between where Ava had started and where she stood now could not be measured in titles or labels. It showed in the way she entered a room without shrinking, in the way she spoke without second-guessing the value of her voice, in the way others began to listen before she even finished. One morning, as she stepped back into the café for a short shift, the familiar scent of coffee wrapping around her like a memory. Nothing about the space had changed. The same counter, the same hum of machines, the same quiet conversations, but she was not the same person standing behind it. A customer approached, placing an order without looking up, the rhythm of the moment familiar, almost automatic. Ava prepared the drink with the same precision as always, sliding it across the counter with a calm, steady hand. The customer glanced up briefly, offering a distracted thank you, then moved on. And for a moment, Ava watched the space where he had stood, not with resentment, not with reflection, just with clarity. Later that day, back at the hospital, she stood in a room filled with students again, this time not at the edge, not at the back, but within the space itself, her presence no longer unnoticed, no longer questioned. Ethan spoke at the front, his voice carrying the same authority, but when he asked a question, his gaze did not scan the room blindly. It found her without searching, not as an exception, but as part of the structure. Ava met it without hesitation. Not to prove anything, not to respond to expectation, but because she belonged there. And in that quiet exchange, something settled into place, not as a conclusion, but as a truth that no longer needed to be defended. The room held its breath for a fraction of a second, then moved forward, as it always would. But beneath it all, something remained, something simple, something steady. She had not argued,